Welcome to Counterterrorism Today. I'm Dan Diker, your host, and today we're talking about Russian intervention in Syria, stability or chaos. It's a major subject in view of the recent reports coming out of Amnesty International blaming Russia for war crimes. And are we really talking about a completely new Middle East? Are we talking about a new Cold War between Russia, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey? We have here probably one of the most professional panels on this topic that we could ever hope for. And I'm really delighted to introduce everyone. Dr. Eli Karmon, senior researcher at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. It's great to have you back, Dr. Karmon, once again. And a new friend and colleague joining us here on Counterterrorism Today, Dr. Alisa Fainberg, who is a postgraduate fellow at Tel Aviv University and a specialist in ISIS and Iran and other things Middle East. Did your doctorate if I'm not mistaken, in Russia itself?
Yes, in St. Petersburg.
In St. Petersburg. And of course, we're very, very delighted to have Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Uri Ben Yaakov, who is an expert in Syria and also in counter-terror legislation, which will be for another show, but very important to understand the types of processes that are going on here in Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. We have a lot to talk about. Dr. Karmon, are we looking at a no less than a completely new Middle East in view of Russian intervention in Syria?
Indeed, the Russian military intervention on the ground in Syria, because it's a long-time intervention, mostly political, and if you want, in support of the regime. But this intervention on the ground is not only changing the balance of power between the Assad regime and the opposition, but it is changing the balance of power probably in the Middle East itself, and even on the global arena, because it is putting the United States and even the West as a bloc in face of a new situation in which Russia wants to become again one of the two main leading powers in the world.
You know, Dr. Fainberg, in view of what Dr. Karmon is saying about Russia's re-emergence as one of the great superpowers in the world, I spoke to a Syrian opposition member last night. Syrian opposition member said, this is a new balance of terror. You have Russia as the father saint of Shia terror, and he's fighting radical Sunni terror. So when you look at the calculation, it's just more terror. It's just rebalanced with Russia now sponsoring the Iranian crescent. What do you think about that? Is Russia really the new sponsor and father saint of radical Shia terror, or is it a stabilizing influence?
I think Russia in Syria now is seeking for new friends, if we can say it, in Iran, for example, because Russia lost, actually Putin lost all his old friends from Ukraine, yes, from Georgia and others. So this is one of the main target. Another target, not target, of course, cause, not main cause, but still a cause in Russian intervention in Syria is, for my opinion and from analysis of Russian media, is Putin tries to deflect attention of citizens from domestic problems on the one hand and from the almost lost war with Ukraine on another.
Well, here you have it, distracting attention. Don't we know that Lieutenant Colonel Uri Ben Yaakov, as a classic theme in major interventions of let's call them non-Western countries. In this particular case, in Syria. This doesn't seem to be a new development for Russia. Russia has had a naval port at Tartus. It's had an airport at Latakia. So this, in a way, for observers of Syria and analysts such as you, sir, this is perhaps something new that caught military analysts by surprise. Why should it have caught them by surprise?
Well, I suppose that Russia is coming back into the area after a period of time that we saw more and more influence of United States and the Western countries. You are totally right. Advisors have been in Syria, Russian advisors, since 1970-something.
71 even.
Right. Including just before the Yom Kippur War, when they left just before the war. And they are coming back again to take or to show the power in the Middle East, power that they lost, and they just show it recently a little bit with Egypt, a little bit with Saudi Arabia, and more now in Syria. So we should expect that they are not going soon back home, and they will present there and they will show to the Western world that they are coming slowly back to their power.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, we have a debate about whether Russian military and political intervention on the ground is a major destabilizing influence also for Israel. It's a frightening development for Israel. There's a debate going on in Israeli intelligence and security circles. Dr. Karmon, what is your sense of that debate?
I think that on the short term, the Russian intervention keeps the situation more or less balanced. And from the Israeli point of view, as long as the war between the regime and its Hezbollah and Iranian allies against the Sunni alliance is going on, it's a good thing. On the longer term, I think the longer the alliance on the ground between Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, and clearly the Bashar al-Assad regime will continue, the Russian will have to pay something to the Iranian allies. And in this sense, Iran, after the nuclear deal, which was a success from their point of view, they can now become a kind of legitimate power, allied with another global power, and this strengthens their position, together the position of the Russia. And on the longer run, I think this is a real threat to Israeli interest. Although for the moment, as we see, Israel is quite successful in coordinating what we call the deconfliction or deconflicting the two military sides. And by the way, Israel was quite cautious in the Ukraine crisis. Israel did not use sanctions against Russia, which gives it some kind of card in the negotiations with Russia on the Syrian situation.
I'll just mention, Dr. Karmon, in view of your focus on the Russian regime and their particular interests, that I was in Moscow several years ago, and I spoke with Rabbi Lazar, who is the #1 Jewish connection to Putin, to President Putin, and he made it very clear, Rabbi Lazar, that that the Russian leader has a very strong feeling for Israel. When you talk about deconfliction and coordination, that in fact what lies deep in his strategic mindset and his soul is a commitment to the Jewish state, because there are so many Russian Israelis here, and because he admires Israel as a tough little fighter in the neighborhood. What do you think, Dr. Fainberg?
What I would like to mention, what is interesting after conflict with the Ukraine, yes, after this war with Ukraine, and after recent conflict with Turkey, Russian media, yes, and Russian citizens, they really turned to Israel. Israel now in media, especially in television, newspapers, is the almost friend #1 of Russia, of Russian citizens. So I think I'm not sure about the long terms, but in short terms, yes, Russia and
Israel there's a strong connection there in the meantime. I want to raise another issue to the three of you. There is something very strange going on in Russian-Iranian relations. Because on the one hand, you know, Russia has been selling S-300 anti-aircraft systems, now S-400 anti-missile systems to the Islamic Republic. And on the other hand, the Islamic Republic of Iran poses a dire threat to Moscow with its own battery of missiles, rockets, weapons, and Quds Force operatives on the ground, as it does to any Western countries. What do you folks think about that? Do you want to take a crack at that, Lieutenant Colonel?
Yes. I think basically that the Iranian didn't change the attitude to the area. We can see basically that the communication between the Iranian and the Russian are ongoing for several months already, before the Russians intervene in Syria. So everything was planned in advance.
Between the Russians and the Iranians. I mean,
Right.
there's close working relationship
Right,
here.
right. That's what we believe. So we can see now that this is the operation going on from something that was planned during the last few months, including with President Assad, and they're just doing what they planned. And both, I think that the Iranians are those that get more positive and advantage from what happened, and for the short term, for sure, and I think that the Russians will get more during the long run.
Eli, what do you think?
I think that the two sides have huge interest, common interest. First of all, in Syria itself, economic interest. We saw that there are some investments of $20 billion, I think, by Russia in Iran itself. Just 2 days ago, they announced they begin to building new atomic reactors near Bushehr. But again, on the longer term, there will be some problem if the Russians will decide on a more independent or not anti-Iranian, but taking decisions that are not so accepted by the Iranian leadership, especially concerning the fate of President Bashar al-Assad. And just today there was information that Iranian high-level officers were killed during bombardment by the Russian Air Force. This was probably collateral damage, if you want, or friendly fire, but the opposition, the Syrian opposition, immediately took the advantage and announced this is the Russian way to fight on the ground and to keep its cards open.
You know, Dr. Fainberg, let's get into the Russian mind. Let's get into Putin's mind for a second. To Putin's mind. Let's try. It's difficult to penetrate, perhaps. One of the most extraordinary leaders, really, of the 21st century thus far, in terms of this extraordinary move into the Middle East, with virtually no American and no Western objection on the ground to this move. What goes on in his mind when he looks at Moscow? Moscow itself has a very high percentage of Muslims today, and my understanding from friends in Washington is that President Putin is looking to create more of a balance between Sunni and Shia in Moscow, because right now the extremist Sunni threat to him is much greater, and he's looking in a way to balance those interests so that he can create a greater type of a defensive leverage for himself in political warfare between the Shia and the Sunni. Is there can you address that? You can even address it from the point of view of how he looks at the internal threat from Islam to himself in Russia, in Moscow and in Russia.
First of all, I would like to mention that situation with Islam in Russia is very complicated. We don't have in Russia. They don't have anyone like leader. Yes, prominent leader of Islamic leader. Everything is diverse. On one hand, we have Caucasus, North Caucasus, and Chechnya and Dagestan. On the other, we have Tatarstan with other type of Islam. I'm not sure it's really about creating a balance between Shia and Sunni. I think this intervention is also connected and caused at some level by a lot of Russian fighters in Syria, about 2,500 fighters in Syria, which immigrated or went to Syria since 2011, I think, with a great, according to locals, according to local evidences, with a great help of MIA, Russian MIA and FSB.
MIA meaning?
Internal Ministry of International
Internal Affairs. Right. Eli, what you want to add to this, or using
balance
of power in Moscow?
First of all, most of the Muslims in Russia are Sunnis. Now, being allied with the most important Shia state, Iran, and also, by the way, with the Shia in Baghdad and the Shia in Damascus and the Shia in Beirut, is not good in the Middle East. So we see that Russia is trying to improve its relations with the Sunni powers, especially with Egypt, which is the most important country in the region still. And even with the Saudis visited, the leadership visited 2 times the Russians. There is some kind of negotiations. And the main problem, by the way, on this negotiations, is the fate of Bashar al-Assad. So they are aware that to be too close to Iran or representing only the interests of Iran, in the end, they will not be able to have this very important standing in the region.
Yeah. What about the Americans, Lieutenant Colonel Uri Ben Yaakov? It looks like, any way you look at it, the American military and political echelons have been shamed by Russia's expansion in the Middle East.
Well, they're continuing losing power. I think it started big time on 2011 when President Obama came into the area, actually to Egypt, and how we treat the Egyptian regime during 2011, and he's letting Russia coming back into the game, and you can see it as a positive thing as long as we are analyzing what happened during the last decade when we don't have anymore 2 big countries that are controlling the world, and things starting being missed in one way or another. So not everybody know what are the rules of the game, and starting doing things that they didn't used to do before. So when you have the 2 now back in power, or if we will have the 2 back in power, because the balance now is changing a bit, I think it will make a new, or not a new, but a better order globally.
A better global order due to Russia's intervention in Syria. That the premise of your observation is real optimism. I mean, an optimistic outcome here.
It's not only the intervention in Syria; it's more than that. It's the fact that the Russian starting having interests in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, as Dr. Karmon just mentioned. The fact that they are getting rid of some other problems that they caused just recently in Ukraine, for instance. So now they're getting back into power, and they are showing to NATO that the problem with Turkey is not only Turkey, it's in front of NATO, actually. So they are showing the world that they are back to power in one way or another. It takes time. It's not totally powered yet, but it will.
I have a more pessimistic intuition on this, and I'll share with you why, and I'd really like to hear your reaction. You know, here you have the United States that has essentially collapsed in terms of its on-the-ground influence in the Middle East. It is the laughingstock of both its former allies as well as its new enemies. And in fact, if the United States, after the Obama administration, wants to reassert itself, which it seems to me it is a very strong possibility because today it's completely unasserted, then you have the first head-on potential conflict with Russia in a potentially Cold War situation opposite the United States. What is your sense of that, Dr. Karmon? Are we looking possibly at a new Cold War?
I won't call it Cold War because it's not based on ideological differences, huge ideological differences. This is a really issue of balance of power between the important global players. But I think that the first, I would say, error was done by the Americans when in 2005, 2006, they decided to deploy anti-missiles systems and radars in Poland and Czech Republic, challenging the Russian view, which saw it as a direct threat to their strategic military situation. And from there, the Russians decided to, which by the way was supportive of the American intervention in Afghanistan and even in Iraq, So from there, the Russians, especially Putin personally, changed their attitude vis-à-vis the United States. But the issue, I think that the aggressive way in trying to change the status quo, because it's not only Ukraine, it's Crimea was annexed by Russia. It is trying to build a kind of mini state in Donetsk, or some of the regions of Ukraine. And by the way, I think, like one or two other experts, that they intend to build in Syria an Alawite mini state under their direct sponsorship. And here, perhaps, they will be in conflict with the Iranians, because they have very important military assets there. It's as you said, the Tartus harbor. It is the Latakia, which is a new, by the way, military platform. And even we must remember, in the past they had intelligence bases here near the Israeli border. So I think that they are quite aggressive. The American behavior is hesitant, and sometimes I would say zigzagging, okay? Because at the beginning they were very angry, then they decided to deconflict, then now Kerry was in Moscow to decide the diplomatic setup for the future of the civil war in Syria. So they are cooperating, on the other hand, with the Russians. And I think this is seen by the Russians as a way to gain influence not only in the Middle East, but even possibly as a card in the Ukrainian crisis. We saw the French, for instance, the French, after the attack in Paris, decided to see in Russia a very important ally in the fight against terrorism. So this move, for the moment, is paying for President Putin.
What about what about the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room, in this room, as well as in the larger Middle Eastern theater, is Turkey, and a major non-Arab power that's vying for supremacy in the Middle East at this point under its neo-Ottoman prime minister and president. How serious, Dr. Fainberg, do you feel the Turkish downing of the Russian warplane was, and looking at it from a strategic point of view? How dangerous do you think the downing of the Russian warplane by the Turks is, and how it does it characterize Turkish the very bad negative state of Turkish-Russian relations today? How do you see that event, or how are you seeing the relationship?
From what is happening now in Russia, I think that's really bad. It's really influenced very bad, and the relationship between Russia and Turkey are very bad. We have a broad deportation of Turkish citizens and Turkish students from Russia. We have a lot of problems even of Russian citizens on the border in Russia when they came from Turkey back. We have this boycott of Turkish products, yes, of Turkish food and others. So yes,
it's a problem.
It's a very big problem.
Lieutenant Colonel Ben Yaakov, this event between Turkey and Russia is also manifested diplomatically and politically in the Kurds being invited to Moscow, and as another point of aggravation between the Turks and the Russians. You think that there's, from an Israeli point of view, something positive in that? Because we've been fighting, or fighting might be a strong word, but pushing, advocating for a strong Turkish independent areas for some time, which could be a real help to Israel.
I think that yes. I think that basically you can see that during the last week or 10 days, we can see better negotiations between Turkey and Israel, first of all, which improving the relations, and it's a good thing for us.
That was a surprise, wasn't it? How quickly the Turks turned around, and you hear the neo-Ottoman Hamas supporter Erdogan saying, Israel can be our friend. We can put this behind us. This is Israel. The truth is, Israelis have been the Israeli government since 2009 and 2010. Mavi Marmara was 2010, and since 2009 was already pushing to try to improve relations with Turkey. And all of a sudden, 6-7 years later, boom, Turkey comes running back at some point here.
Right, which show us basically that countries are working according to the interests, the immediate interest and the long-term interests. So it doesn't matter what is the situation and how it's being presented. Usually what is important is what is going on below the ground. And we can see that the Turkish interest now is to upgrade the relations with Israel, and that's what they are doing. And I do think that the Kurds will get in one way or another something which we don't know if it will be only in northern Iraq or also in some parts of Syria.
Northwestern Syria.
Yes. Definitely they won't get any stake in Turkey, which in the long term will put them still in the aggravance of wanted to doing something against Turkey.
Dr. Karmon, do you see some sort of repair of the Turkish-Israel relation? To what degree? How can it look? Much better military cooperation
with Turkey? No, I don't think that it is possible, at least in the foreseeable future. I think that as long as Erdogan is president, it will be very difficult to return to the strategic relationship in the past. They have very important economic interest, and we see that the economic relationship is very strong and even developing with Turkey, because they need to enforce their own economy, the Turks. If we look to what Erdogan was doing the last days, it's a lot of rhetoric probably vis-à-vis Russia, because there is also the issue of gas, which Turkey is interested, but also Gazprom, the Russian big company, is interested in. And some say that the downing of the plane was a move in order to try to push NATO in support of Turkey against the Russian presence in Syria. The Russian presence in Syria is a very dangerous move for Turkey. Once because they are supporting the Bashar al-Assad regime, which is abhorred by Erdogan and his government and his party, but at the same time, militarily, they put Turkey in a very difficult position, because they historically they were enemies of Russia. So Turkey has a very difficult situation now, and one of the moves they did, by the way, was to send troops in Iraq in order to show that they still have cards against Russia, because the Russians would like to be also involved in the Iraqi fight against ISIS or Daesh. The Kurdish issue is even more complicated, complicating the situation, because the PKK now is fighting the regime of AKP in Turkey, and the Russians, which remember that the PKK was a Marxist-Leninist organization and was allied in a way with the Soviet Union in the past and even with Russia, they see the Kurds, by the way, as neutrals in the conflict in Syria. They see the Kurds as a potential ally against Turkey and even against the United States, perhaps, which for the moment is supporting the Kurds in Syria and Iraq.
If our listeners could really get their arms and understand everything going on here, I think they would be getting a AA in any PhD program on the Middle East. It's very, very complicated today. Dr. Fainberg, I know you wanted to get a comment in here on the Russian-Turkish issue.
Yes, I would like to add one interesting thing here. After starting this conflict between Russia and Turkey, in Russian media again, I noticed the connection, the attempt to connect Russian Tatars in Crimea, especially, with Turkish, and to blame them. And I think this is the additional move to and attempt to punish the Crimea, because now what we see in the domestic politics in Russia, we see the attempts of Putin and the government, federal government, to punish the Crimea for this electricity crisis as well, and for this For example, they refused to give any of the promised money from federal budget to Crimea. And now they're accusing also the local administration in this for this connection, possible virtual connection, not real, between local Tatar community and Turkey, and also blame them for local Tatars moving to the ISIS and joining the ISIS.
Well, that's a real domestic consideration for Mr. Putin. This issue of the intrigue inside of Crimea and trying to leverage up this international move in the Middle East in order to affect domestic challenges at home. Here's an open question for the three of you. There are those that say the bottom line is economic interests, and Mr. Putin, President Putin, has been well known for his extraordinary success in increasing the penetration of Gazprom. In fact, one can argue that the oil and gas reserves in Syria are exactly in the northwestern part, in what would be called the Alawalistan, which until 1948 was a separate Alawite commonwealth or separate Alawite autonomous area. And now the thinking that's coming from some analysts is that if, in fact, Mr. Assad is, or Dr. Assad, as the case may be, is an optometrist, is pushed off to the side, sidelined and delegitimized and isolated, that Putin might help him establish again this autonomous area that has all the oil and gas, and presto, President Putin is right there as the father saint in billions of dollars of oil and gas in that part of Syria. What do you think? Is there a big economic interest in Syria also, Eli Karmon?
Yeah, there are big economic interests for sure, for Russia, for Turkey, by the way, Israel and Egypt and Greece and even Cyprus. But I think that we must look to the strategic and military situation. By the way, they introduced a lot of Navy assets in the Mediterranean, which is a new development also. They are using the situation for exercising their the latest kinds of modern weapons, missiles from submarines, missiles from the Caspian Sea against. So this is a move in order to show the muscle of the Russian military vis-à-vis the West, especially the United States, and to try to build, as we said at the beginning, a new balance of power between Russia and the West, and increasing in a very important sense the presence and influence in the Middle East.
What kind of this? It sounds like it might be an opportunity for Israel here. If you look at Israel's geopolitical requirements, Israel now could be, with the signing of the recent Noble Energy gas deal, it could be a gas exporter over the next 5 years, which is no less than revolutionary for Israel. Israel, as I understand, has been quite interested in the developments in Kurdistan, Syria, as a potential beachhead against radical Islamic terror. And in this discussion today, we've been talking about some of the similar interests that the Russian bear has in Syria. Is this moment potentially an opportunity, a strategic opportunity for Israel-Russian relations over the new intervention in Syria?
Yes, I do believe that the present time is a huge opportunity because we are focusing on a new order in one way or another. In few months from now, in few years from now, when the war will come to an end, we will have to build a new order. Sykes-Picot agreement is not.
You mean, Lieutenant Colonel, a new regional order for the entire for the Middle East?
For all the Middle East, and I think that it's much easier to build all the things all together than solving one problem here and one problem there. So even our relations with the Palestinians, even this one can come into a solution while all the Middle East is reordering. We don't know yet how. We don't know what will be the borders. How many countries will be there? Obviously, we have the Shiite in Iraq that will have to be connected somehow to Iran. We will have the Alawite country that will be Syria or not Syria, it doesn't matter, with Assad or without Assad. With this border or with other borders, I suppose northwest Syria will be still under the Alawite regime. But again, new order will surround all the area.
Dr. Fainberg, do you agree with Lieutenant Colonel with Uri, that are we looking at a new Middle Eastern order, and in that order we have a new opportunity between Russia and Israel on a strategic level?
I hope so. With this unexpected politics of Russia, I hope that there will be a new context, a new connection between Russia and Israel, but we'll see.
Yeah, a conservative and not too aggressive,
diplomatic.
Yes,
diplomatic. Well, people that think that they can be a prophet, prophet, in the Middle East, frequently get into trouble. Dr. Karmon, a new opportunity for Israeli-Russian relations now?
I believe, like Uri, that we'll have a process of Balkanization of the Middle East. It is clear that Syria will not return to be a united Syria, probably also Iraq. We see what happens in Yemen, and even in Lebanon. There were huge demographic changes last. For instance, 1.5 million Syrian Sunnis in Lebanon, and the same in Jordan, which changed the demography between Palestinians and Jordanians in Jordan and Shia and Sunni in Lebanon. But I don't believe personally that Russia is a best solution. Although the West will have to take in account their interest. But as we see when we speak with a regime like the Erdogan regime, and even with the regime in Moscow, they are not completely democratic regimes, and therefore we must take in consideration that the changes there, and the processes that are inside these countries are in the end dangerous for Israel. And I'm, as I said, very worried by a possible alliance on the long term between Russia, Iran, and the statelet of Syria and Hezbollah.
What's your sense about the dangers in Israeli-American security relations in view of the new assertiveness and, let's call it, military dominance to a certain degree of Russia on the ground? We haven't seen this type of Russian military confidence since the Soviet Union period, really in the 1970s. Even before they were ejected, Soviet military advisors were ejected from Egypt and were all over the Middle East. Are we looking at a possible...
Not from Syria. They always were in Syria.
They never left Syria. But so let's talk about that presence in today's terms. Does it create a real potential problem for Israel-American relations on a military level?
Well, I don't think it's a problem. I think that for us, from our point of view, from Israel's point of view, the American will have to be in position that they still have power in the area and they will assist us, continue assisting us. I don't think that we have a problem now, by the way. I mean, yes, we have
political problems, but
political problems, but not actual problems in terms of security. So I suppose that it will continue. We know that if we will look at Saudi Arabia in the agreement that was done with the Iranian regime, so people are looking at Saudi Arabia as a country that was abandoned by the US, but it's not really the actual situation, specifically not with us.
Last comment, I think we'll just wrap it up. A final observation about the region in general. Russia clearly is there, is inserted, is a major international player, has internationalized the Middle East in a sense, way beyond its regional importance. Dr. Karmon, your final thought.
We'll have to see how the situation develops, because the Russians could be in a similar situation like in Afghanistan in the 70s and the 80s, because the Sunni opposition will continue to fight them. And so this will be a very fluid situation, very dynamic. So it's very difficult for the moment to see how exactly the various alliances will remain in place and who will win from this complex situation.
Dr. Fainberg, final thought?
Yes, I would first agree with Dr. Karmon. I think this Russian intervention in Syria is in the view of domestic crisis and real domestic crisis and domestic problems, it's a like desperate attempt to balance the powers and to confront these Russian fighters also to defeat the Russian fighters in Syria, which are a real problem for Russia now in terms of threats from these fighters, from the ISIS to Russia. And yes, we'll see. I don't think that Russia will go away soon. It will stay. Russia will stay. Russian troops will stay in Syria. And yes, of course, I hope it will not turn into Afghanistan in the 70s.
Yeah, that's a good hope, that it will not turn into Afghanistan or Afghanistan of the 70s or Syria of the 2000s. And here we are. Dr. Ben Yaakov, your final thoughts, sir.
No doctor yet.
On the way. Lieutenant Colonel, Reserve.
I suppose that we have two players in this game, which are the American and the Russians, and all of us will have to dance according to their orders. They will continue having their interest in the area, and I really hope that the solution that will be drawn between Russia and the US, or maybe the US with their allies, the coalition, will be something that will last for the long term.
Well, I join your hopes, prayers, and observations. I think the headline, the sikum, the summary headline is "Dancing with the Russian Bear." The whole Middle East is dancing with the Russian bear, whether they want to or not, with a bottle of vodka in the left and a gun and an olive tree in the other hand. On the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Uri Ben Yaakov, a senior researcher here at the ICT, International Center for Counterterrorism. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom, your thinking. Dr. Alisa Fainberg of the Alliance Center of Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, thank you very much. And of course, Dr. Eli Karmon, senior researcher here at the IDC Herzliya and a professor at the Lauder School for Diplomacy, Counterterrorism, and Strategy as well. Thank you very much for joining us here on Counterterrorism Today. We'll look forward to seeing you, our listening and viewing audience, again soon.